Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Whitmore, a senior fellow at CEPA, and I'd like to welcome you all to our virtual conversation, a final stand on Nord Stream 2. Good morning to our friends in North America and good afternoon to our friends in Europe. In order to frame our discussion, I'd like to just start by tossing out a few quick observations. First, the battle over Nord Stream 2 is entering into yet another decisive round. Russia's natural gas pipeline, which is viewed by many as a threat to transatlantic security, is now 94% complete. And the United States is determined not to let that number go any higher. The U.S. State Department moved recently to potentially impose sanctions on investors and other business participants in the project, a move that would represent an expansion of existing sanctions. This has led to something of a rift with some European allies. German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas accused the United States of, quote, disrespecting Europe's right and sovereignty to decide for itself where and how we source our energy. Second, Europe itself is far from united on the issue of Nord Stream 2. While Germany and France tend to be less concerned about excessive dependence on Russian energy, other countries like Poland and Lithuania staunchly oppose the new pipeline project and have built their own LNG facilities to ensure energy independence from Russia. And finally, there is a sharp disagreement about the very nature of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project. Supporters tend to describe it as just another commercial venture, while opponents call it a geopolitical project and a power play by Moscow. And with that, I will introduce our distinguished panelists. Chris Robinson is the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Russia. Margarita Asanova is a fellow with CEPA's Democratic Resilience Program and author of the recent CEPA report, Nord Stream 2, Myths, Reality, and the Way Forward. Margarita is also the author of the book, The New Energy Geopolitics of Southeastern Europe. Ambassador John Herbst is director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council and the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. And last but not least, Dr. Benjamin Schmidt is a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard University and the former energy security advisor at the U.S. State Department. So welcome to all of you. Good morning. And by way of the way I want to structure this is to keep it as interactive as possible, do a couple rounds of questions with our panelists for about 30 minutes before we field questions from our virtual audience. I'd like to ask our panelists to keep their remarks as brief as possible. Chris, let's start with you because there is a clear gap in threat perception between the United States and the European allies, and sometimes among the European allies, as I noted, with the US, the Baltic states, and Poland seeing a clear and present danger from the Russian pipeline project, while Germany and France are less concerned. What can be done diplomatically to bridge that gap, or is that gap even bridgeable?
Great. So, Brian, thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's a great pleasure to be with this really tremendous panel of experts who've done so much and continue to do so much to focus on European energy security and the risks of Russian aggression. So, Brian, maybe the best way to start out then would be to lay out what our policy approach is, how we perceive this threat, because I think the framing is both correct, but I think it also misrepresents to a degree how broadly the threat of Russian aggression and how energy relates to that is held across Europe. So the United States, we've consistently opposed Nord Stream 2 pipeline and others like it. We've been clear in our support for the rights of our European allies and partners to have reliable choices for energy, choices that are not conditioned or held hostage to political and military pressure from the Kremlin. The Kremlin continues to push Nord Stream 2, the second line of Turk Stream, although we're focused on Nord Stream 2 today, as part of this effort, and Brian, you touched on it, to deepen its malign influence across Europe and expand European energy dependence on Russian energy. I think let's be clear, Nord Stream 2 is not a commercial project. It's the Russian government's key tool to exploit and expand European dependence on Russian energy. Russia uses politically motivated energy export pipelines to create national and regional dependencies on Russian energy supplies, leveraging these dependencies to expand its political, its economic, its military influence, and to undermine transatlantic security and European and transatlantic foreign policy interests. Nord Stream 2, and we've got Ambassador Herbst and Ben who can speak even more in depth about it. It would divert gas that's transiting Ukraine. It would because Ukraine's energy infrastructure serves as a deterrent to Russian aggression. The Kremlin seeks to undermine Ukraine and remove that check on Russian aggression by making that infrastructure obsolete. So we've been clear and consistent in highlighting the danger these projects pose to our shared interest in Europe. Our policy approach is intended to counter Russian malign influence by using all the tools available to support transatlantic energy security, and by extension, hard security as well. We've done more than, and we're going to talk in a second, I'll mention what we're doing on sanctions, but we've done more than that. We've promoted energy options for Europe. We've had successes over the last year with Belarus, Croatia, Lithuania, among others. We're working on projects with our European allies and partners that diversify rather than limit their options. And our ultimate goal is to enhance transatlantic energy security by way of expanding energy suppliers, routes, and types of fuels. So what are we doing, Brian? And you mentioned this at the opening. On July 15th, we expanded and updated our public guidance on Section 232 of CATSA, or the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, to address this growing threat to our national security and transatlantic security. Specifically, we deleted the portions of the public guidance that limited Section 232 to Russian energy export pipeline projects for which a contract was signed on or after August 2nd, 2017. At the same time, we are expanding our Section 232 guidance to include making investments or engaging in other activities related to a broader scope of Russian energy export pipelines. This isn't the imposition of sanctions, but it's a clear warning. Companies that make investments or engage in other activities with respect to these pipelines now run the risk of sanctions. Brian, you asked, what can be done more in terms of engaging across Europe? These sanctions are discretionary. They preserve diplomatic space for continued discussions with the various stakeholders, and we're doing that right now. We've been engaged and reaching out to a range of companies involved in the project to make clear the risk. But our intent and our resolve should be clear to all those to stop these pipelines, and our intent to carry that forward is clear. And Secretary Pompeo said, our change to our guidance puts investments or other activities that are related to Nord Stream 2 at risk of U.S. sanctions. It is a clear warning to companies involved that aiding or abetting Russia's malign influence projects will not be tolerated. Get out now or risk the consequences. This isn't new, but we are updating our tools so that we can carry forward this policy. And Brian, let me sort of conclude then with taking on a couple of the, if you will, the suppositions, the way you framed the discussion. I don't think that, first of all, that these sanctions are anti-European. We hear that a lot, that what you're doing, United States, is anti-European. I think that's a very false narrative, in part driven by Moscow in order to create transatlantic tensions and divisions. More countries oppose Nord Stream 2 now than they ever have before. And we are, by our updated guidance and in cooperation with Congress and their efforts, we are joining our voice to those European voices that are concerned about European security, European energy security, and the threat posed by Russia. So let me stop there and we can turn it back to a broader conversation.
No, thank you for that, Chris. And yeah, I certainly would never suggest that these are anti-European, but I would see that there is this gap in threat perception. There are some major allies who just don't see a threat here, or are saying they don't see a threat, while others do. And what is concerning me right now is how do we bridge that gap in threat perception? Do you have any thoughts on that, perhaps?
Well, I think that's often a challenge when we're dealing with Russian aggression. Obviously, countries that have experienced it more intimately and more recently have a higher sense. But we've seen with Russian malign activity writ large, whether it's the Skripal poisoning attack, Russian meddling in other elections, Russian malign campaigns related to COVID disinformation, for example, that Europe does have a broader sense of threat perception related to Russian malign activities. Nord Stream 2 and Russia's political use of energy as a weapon for malign influence is part and parcel of that broader toolbox that Moscow uses to advance its agenda. And so we need to be involved. We need to, what happens in the European energy space is directly related to transatlantic security and U.S. national security.
Thank you. I want to move to Margarita now, because Margarita, you write a lot about this issue. And one thing that's kind of in my mind, and is something I want everybody to kind of react to this, is there's this feeling we're in the end game right now, as far as Nord Stream 2. There's a narrative out there that it's almost inevitable right now. And that this is the last stand. This is the last chance for opponents of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project to stop it. Is that the case, Margarita? Do you see us in this endgame? Is this truly the last stand, as the title of this event suggests?
It might be one of the last stages, I believe. I wish it happened 3 years ago, when we had more time to react, and all these sanctions were released at that time, and they were. The CATSA was released, was adopted at that time, but there was an exemption because we needed to discuss this with the European Union. We agreed to it. This was a compromise made to European Union to give them a chance to stop this project, which is clearly a political project, by themselves. Unfortunately, during these last 3 years, nothing really happened. The sanctions last year managed to stop the pipelaying activities by Western ships. The upcoming extension of those sanctions, updating of those sanctions by Congress, is going to sanction all the companies that are providing assistance for laying pipes in the Baltic Sea, which includes port facilities, which includes supplier ships, ships that are transporting workers, insurers, and this is a very important part, insurers, because the Russians are planning to use their own ship in combination with a barge, pipelaying barge, to finish the job. But that ship hasn't been able to obtain insurance, a Western insurance, to complete the job since March. It has failed to find a company that is going to agree to insure the project, because these companies know very well that they could be subject to American sanctions. Right now, we have sanctions coming from two directions. One is the CATS Act, the other one is the National Defense Spending Act, the updated, the expanded sanctions that are included there. The two together, it's not just a shot. I think it's a barrage. It's a barrage that is going to have a profound impact on all companies involved in these projects, if they are smart enough to think about consequences. And the consequences could be extremely difficult for them, because, and that's not a threat, it's just our financial system is very pervasive. Every bank in the world has a correspondence bank in New York City. So there is no way any Western company or other company in the world that is working with any bank to ignore US sanctions or the threat of US sanctions. So I think we are nearing the end of the battle, but there are going to be other stages. And the most important stage is going to be, are we going to impose sanctions on any Western agency that certifies this pipeline for exploitation? Because it needs to go through the process. And after that is going to come European Commission, and standing and laying down the ground for exemption from the third energy package, or implementation of the third energy package vis-a-vis Nord Stream 2, that's another pitfall for Gazprom. The fact that Gazprom withdrew, sold its shares in Nord Stream 1, the first pipeline that was completed, that is operational has been operational for several years, is a clear signal that its Western partners are very worried about sanctions. If Gazprom is put under sanctions, this is going to affect every partner of Gazprom. And this is why the Western investors prefer to have a different entity recorded there. So we have now Gazprom International Projects, which is technically Gazprom. It's not going to avoid the danger of sanctions, but it's there. I don't see these sanctions as anti-European. 20 countries in the European Union oppose the pipeline for very, very serious reasons. It is diversionary pipeline. It doesn't bring any new gas. It just will bring gas to Central and Eastern Europe through a different route. And it's going to put in a lot of trouble the entire gas network of Central and Eastern Europe, starting from Poland and going all the way to other countries, all the way to Ukraine. Actually, it's going to be blocked in many places because it's going to be much more difficult to transfer gas from the western direction, that is from the eastern direction.
Thank you, Margarita. I want to remind our audience, if you want to ask questions to our panelists, you can do so in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Margarita, I want to stick with you just for a moment, because I'm hearing it's too late, but it's maybe not too late. And you mentioned the third energy package, which I think is really important. I mean, this is European law. This isn't something somebody from outside is imposing. This is the European Union's own law. And if I understand the law correctly, and I want to help you, I want to ask you to kind of unpack this a little bit for our viewers. But the third energy package effectively says that you have to unbundle your production from your distribution, right? And that you have to open up your distribution networks to third parties. And what I can never really wrap my own head around is why Gazprom isn't being forced to do this. I mean, can you unpack the issue with the third energy package as far as it concerns Gazprom and Nord Stream 2? Because there's been this impression that Gazprom and Nord Stream have this almost implicit exemption from this very important part of European law.
It has been the case until now, simply because the Nord Stream pipeline was considered the pipeline laid on the bottom of the Baltic Sea from Russia to Germany, and it's in international waters pretty much. The third energy package was not specifically addressing this kind of pipelines. But I will give you another example. If our audience remembers, there was a case in Bulgaria regarding South Stream. Back in a day before the South Stream pipeline was cancelled in 2014, when under Gazprom influence, a group of parliamentarians introduced legislation to exempt the territorial waters of Bulgaria in the Black Sea from the third energy package by declaring them not to be European territory. It was a ridiculous attempt. It failed, of course. But this is what Gazprom has been trying to do. There is no exemption in territorial waters, and it shouldn't be. And this is why the directive was amended last year to clearly include that in economic zones and in territorial waters, this is going to be the case. Unbundling, allowing access to third parties, and allowing a regulator to determine whatever transit fees are going to be paid.
Thank you, Mark. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. The German Energy Agency regulator already addressed that. They, in many ways, they refuse to recognize the project as completed, to grandfather it in a way, so that it's exempt from this extension of the European gas directive. It didn't work even in Germany. So I don't think it's going to work in the European Union.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Margarita. I want to move to John now. And John, of course, as I noted, you served as the United States ambassador to Ukraine, and you pay very close attention to Ukrainian affairs. One aspect of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project is the clear intent on the part of Moscow to cut Ukraine out of gas transit to Western Europe, thus depriving Kyiv of badly needed revenue. As we now appear to be entering some sort of endgame here, and I know you had some things to say as to whether or not this is inevitable or not, so I feel free to address that. But how is this being viewed from Kyiv? And what are your concerns about Ukraine's security as we enter what looks like an endgame here?
Look, it's very simple. Nord Stream 2 is a political, not an economic project. In fact, there was even a report in National Defense that was on their website for a month or two in 2018, which explicitly said that Russia's own national interests were not served by this, although Putin and his cronies' interests were, because the Kremlin has spent a small fortune building this pipeline, enabling it to avoid sending their gas, not just through Ukraine, but through Poland, through Belarus. This pipeline now enables the Kremlin to exert energy pressure on Eastern Europe. It also bolsters the German-Russian relationship in ways that are not good for American interests, or for that matter, for European interests. These are all reasons why this project should die. In Ukraine, the consequences are very clear. A deal was reached late last year between Russia and Ukraine on energy gas transit through Ukraine. And it was reached on relatively favorable terms for Ukraine because of the sanctions which had just been passed by the U.S. Congress. And that deal would give Ukraine roughly $3 billion of transit revenues from 2020 through 2024. But as reports indicate, if Nord Stream 2 is actually completed and goes into operation next year, I don't think that will happen, but if it does, by the end of 2021 or early 2022, Moscow will have no need to send gas to Ukraine, and that $3 billion a year in revenue will disappear. There's also another factor. Some people believe, and I don't endorse this, but I also don't dispute it, that Russian interest in maintaining the pipeline through Ukraine until Nord Stream 2 is built has hindered Russian military operations in their war against Ukraine in Donbass, because it could affect the oil pipeline, could destroy, the gas pipeline. So if Nord Stream 2 is built, Ukraine loses the revenues, Russia could play energy politics with not just Ukraine, but with all the countries of Eastern Europe. You strengthen a German-Russian relationship, which is of no value to the United States or to an independent Europe.
Thank you, John. I mean, is there, I guess I'm sticking with Ukraine for a bit. Is there a sense of urgency? And I mean, I'm reluctant to use the term panic in Kyiv right now as they're watching this, because this looks, I mean, there's a growing perception out there that this is about to happen. It's 94% built. Ukraine's been dreading this for a long time. And is there a palpable sense of nervousness and panic right now in Kyiv over this?
There's been great anxiety in Ukraine, certainly over the last several years, regarding Nord Stream 2. And sometimes, because people like to say the sky is falling, even when it's merely cloudy, you hear that in Ukraine. You heard that in 2017, 2018, and you hear it today. But sober-minded Ukrainians who follow this closely recognize that the United States opposition to this has been firm and active. And between the steps taken by the State Department, by the administration recently, between the anticipated sanctions that Congress will levy through the NDAA, I think a body blow will be delivered to the Nord Stream project. And again, those Ukrainians who follow this most closely understand that. So they have not given up the game. And I think the game is going to ultimately turn in their favor and in our favor, in the United States' favor.
Great, thank you, John. I want to turn now to Ben. And Ben, your Twitter feed is probably one of the best and most prolific sources of news and information about Nord Stream 2 on planet Earth. And we are all very grateful for that. And if anybody out there doesn't believe me, just follow @BL Schmidt to find out, and you'll get all the news and information you can consume about this issue. In a series of tweets last week, you kind of caught my attention because you touched on one of my favorite issues, the Nord Stream 2 as a source of malign influence, as something that's not just going to pipe gas into Europe, it's something that is going to pump corruption into Europe as well. In one tweet, you noted correctly that Matthias Warrig, the CEO of Nord Stream 2, is a former Stasi friend of Putin from his KGB days in Dresden. And in another, you wrote that strategic corruption and elite capture are central to the security concerns related to Nord Stream 2. A lot of the panelists have kind of touched on this issue of Nord Stream 2 as something that is going to transport corruption into Europe as well as gas. Ben, I wonder if you could expand on that issue.
Hello, friends. Yeah, thanks, Brian. First of all, that's quite a compliment, given I've only been active on Twitter for about 18 months now since leaving the State Department, so I appreciate that. Let me say, first of all, it's always a pleasure to be able to collaborate with from my perch here at Harvard with all my friends at the Atlantic Council and CEPA on issues so central to transatlantic security. And given this is a CEPA Atlantic Council co-hosted event, this must be some sort of national security Price is Right double showcase. So I'm excited to be here today. But of course, when it comes to Nord Stream 2, you're absolutely right. The price is anything but right, because as you point out, the project is the physical embodiment of the threat of strategic corruption entering the West from authoritarian state-owned enterprises. And that's really why this is so central to global security issues that we face from both Moscow when it comes to energy and Beijing when it comes to telecom, think Huawei. So this is the answer when I get, I get this question all the time. Why the heck are we talking about one pipeline so much for so many years? This is year 6 of this saga. And that's why. And that's why for a project that is clearly not just a commercial deal, I found it increasingly misleading for the energy community to attempt to vet the merits of the Kremlin-backed pipeline in terms of standard market analysis, what I like to call kind of the Bloomberg terminal approach to energy analysis. There's nothing wrong with that on its face. Surely this focus on competing price environments is valid for many energy projects worldwide. But given that Nord Stream 2 is being built as a means for the Russian Federation to extend its ongoing aggression and hybrid activities against the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian sovereignty by circumventing the country, as Ambassador Herbst pointed out, while bringing very little new natural gas to the European market by its diversionary Baltic Sea route, as Margarita pointed out. To apply this sort of monodisciplinary economic analysis to the project is disingenuous to say the least. You really need this technical, economic, geopolitical, multidisciplinary analysis to really understand this. And of course, the Kremlin is hoping that this is the sort of level of discussion we'll have. It's just going to be this economic debate. And I'll point out that that's what they've been relentlessly attempting to frame the issue as a trade issue and a faux debate about the merits of U.S. LNG versus Russian pipeline gas. And unfortunately, a lot of commentators have obliged that because what they're hoping in Moscow is that the transatlantic community does not focus on the national security impacts that the pipeline would have on Ukraine, European energy security, and as a conduit of strategic corruption. So Brian, among those, and it's often overlooked in this discussion, is the gravest energy threat that I think Russia poses to the West. It's really not market-based, and it's not on specific diversification merits, but the export of strategic corruption through energy infrastructure development. In particular, when you look at the activities of Gazprom, Rosneft, Rosatom, they regularly use the development of large-scale energy infrastructure projects, think pipelines like Nord Stream 2, but also hydrocarbon upstream swaps, civil nuclear installations, to exacerbate elite capture trends in Western capitals. Once captured by the offer of a lucrative lobbying contract or corporate positions associated with Russian state-owned enterprises, Western current and former senior officials regularly take positions that either fail to respond to active national security threats posed by the Russian Federation, or else they take positions that are overtly pro-Kremlin, often both. So the result of this is the continued inability to come to a transatlantic security consensus on the appropriate countermeasures to take to deter further Kremlin hybrid warfare activities, divergent national strategies to address Russian threats, and the associated degradation of national security norms and the assumptions that are only to the benefit of Moscow. Because instead of normal commerciality, these projects are often used as a means of enriching contractors with close ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin. You and I have talked about this before, Brian, including companies controlled by Russian oligarchs already targeted under the U.S. sanctions program, like Timchenko and the Rotenberg brothers. But Moscow's use of geopolitical projects like Nord Stream 2 as a means of channeling benefits to favored Russian oligarchs is not limited to domestic allies of Mr. Putin. Of course, we all know the story of former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who advocated for the first Nord Stream pipeline while in office and was appointed chairman of Nord Stream AG shortly after leaving. Since then, he's become one of Putin's most effective Trojan horses in Europe. Over the past few years, however, with the advancement of Nord Stream 2, this list of Schroederized officials just got a bit longer. For example, former Austrian Chancellor Christian Kern, who penned a strong letter co-authored by then German Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel decrying the 2017 CATSA sanctions, which were described earlier. He was appointed to the board of Kremlin-controlled Russian railways. And last year, former Austrian Foreign Minister Karin Kneißl, with whom Mr. Putin danced at her wedding while in office, penned a Nord Stream 2 endorsement piece for Russian propaganda outlet RT. And I'll just kind of finish up with a few thoughts here based on a recent episode of the Power Vertical podcast, if I may, to plug your own product. Imagine if George W. Bush or Barack Obama were currently working on behalf of China's Huawei. Take a moment and imagine that. this wouldn't be just a major political story in Washington, it'd be the only story, full stop. Sadly, the electorate in some Western European nations seems to have accepted this Schroederized status quo, and therefore there's little political motivation for former senior officials to resist becoming well-compensated conduits of Russian malign influence. Case in point, just a few weeks ago, there was a relative lack of outrage in Germany that the main witness called by the German Bundestag to criticize bipartisan sanctions actions aimed at stopping Nord Stream 2 was Schroeder himself, in spite of the fact he was simply introduced at the hearing as a former chancellor rather than as a well-compensated Nord Stream 2 lobbyist. And just to wrap up with what I said on your podcast, Brian, I was really struck both reading and then listening to the discussion you had with Catherine Belton on her analysis of Putin's people. If you haven't read it, please do read it. It may very well go down as the seminal text on Moscow's contemporary development of weaponized corruption in the West. The biggest takeaway that I had from the book, what was new for me, was how Belton was able to draw a line starting way back with the work that Putin and the KGB were undergoing to prepare for the downfall of the Soviet Union, all the way to those trends associated with projects like Nord Stream 2 today. According to Belton's research, Putin was very likely part of what was known as Operation Luch, which was aimed at trying to set up a front network of Russian influence operators among willing individuals and businesses across the West. Of course, as this was going on, Belton reports that, quote, one of the Stasi operatives Putin worked closely with in Dresden was a short, round-faced German, Matthias Warnig, who is later to become part of the Putin regime, which included a number of roles, starting way back in the 90s with his heading up of Dresdner Bank, which was one of a number of what Belton describes as KGB-linked foreign bankers that would work with Timchenko, and of course, working with Nord Stream. So what can we do? The reality here needs to be seriously considered if there's any hope of reversing Russian malign energy influence during this decade. And so we need a more frank public discourse on these trends, especially as an increasing number of transatlantic security issues have at their core a debate over Western cooperation with Russian, Chinese, or other authoritarian state-owned enterprises. It's as urgent as ever that the transatlantic community not shield these projects because of a perceived short-term economic interest, but instead we need to call a summit that can begin a robust diplomatic dialogue that can harmonize norms on investment screening and post-government career regulations. Think of a transatlantic FARA Act consensus. Otherwise, these disputes will continue to emerge unabated since our adversaries increasingly know that they can become wedge issues. There are many on both sides of the Atlantic that say that change can be achieved through trade, that democratic norms and liberal values will trickle from the West through the increase of energy project developments with Russia. But in fact, the flow has increasingly been the other direction to export weaponized corruption and bad behavior to undermine those democratic norms the world over. So in short, when it comes to Nord Stream 2, in terms of the cost on transatlantic security, the price is wrong. Brian, unless you have the audio clip of The Price is Right losing horn ready, I'll just say that this is why I think it's so important that the U.S. has continued to take a technology-calibrated sanctions action on widely bipartisan consensus in the short term to make sure that this physical embodiment of Putin's crony capitalism just can't come into operation. And that's, of course, a trend that our friend, former Estonian President Toomas Ilves coined as Schroederization. And more recently, I should just point out for the audience, updated to the Slavic form, Schroederizacja.
Well, thank you for that, Ben. It's a sign of an awesome panelist when he or she anticipates the moderator's follow-up question and answers it before the moderator is able to ask it.
We've been doing this for a while, Brian.
We've been doing this for a while. We can finish each other's sentences.
Years and years and years.
But I will join you, Ben, in wholeheartedly endorsing Catherine Belton's amazing book, Putin's People, and specifically those chapters on the Dresden days and how they were kind of prologue to what we are seeing today were particularly illuminating for me. I would also add that, and you pointed out, the CEO of Nord Stream 2 is not the only former Stasi agent that is in Gazprom Germania. And in fact, there's been plenty of stuff in the German press about this. There was an excellent article in Stern back in 2008 about how Gazprom Germania was heavily populated with former Stasi agents who were believed to be carrying out Moscow's wishes. And with that, I do want to go to our questions, because we do have some questions, and I'm going to start with one from Ambassador Michael McFaul, the former United States ambassador to Russia, and he asks, how have U.S. German relations been impacted by our sanctions policy? Of course, it's contentious, but how contentious? Do our disagreements on Nord Stream 2 spill into other bilateral issues? Chris, I think that one is tailor-made for you.
Great. Well, look, I think there are some differences in the U.S.-Germany relationship writ large. I mean, we have differences on trade policy right now. There are questions about our NATO obligations. Let me reframe that as, I think, writ large, we have a good dialogue. We support Germany, along with France, in their effort to lead the Normandy process to bring a settlement to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And I think that's a very positive process. We saw some good actions by the German government, both with public attribution for the Bundestag hacking and for the killing, the criminal indictment for the killing in the Tiergarten of a ethnic Chechen last summer. And so I think there's growing convergence between the United States and Germany on the risks posed by Russian malign influence. And we will continue to engage in a robust dialogue with Germany. But I think, as many of the other speakers have pointed out, it's not just a U.S.-Germany, Nord Stream 2 and the impact is not just a U.S.-Germany issue. It is an issue for the entire transatlantic community and the threat perceptions of a broad range of European states who are impacted by both the elite capture and corruption that Ben pointed out, but the more direct and imminent security threats that Nord Stream would pose going forward.
Ryan, may I jump in here?
Yeah, of course, John. I was going to ask you to, actually.
Okay. I do a fair amount of work in Germany because as we work on American policy towards both Ukraine and Russia, Germany is a key actor. And a lot of very sensible Germans who I work with were warning me last fall that Congress should not put sanctions on Nord Stream 2. This would be a critical step against U.S.-German relations. I didn't dismiss what they said, but I also didn't accept it. And what I can say is that the German reaction to those sanctions was very, very mild. And the relationship weathered that problem. And even today, the statement that came from the foreign minister about the administration's actions was, I'd say, nothing major. I am confident that our relationship can weather an American fatal blow against Nord Stream 2. Although I think that we could do better in our overall relationship with Germany. But that's a separate question.
Yeah, no, it is indeed. And but I would, just to kind of add on to this, I would say that in my experience, opinions in Germany about this issue are not exactly monolithic. You will find Germans who are as opposed to this project as the Poles or the Lithuanians. So Germany is not completely united on this issue. Chris, you look like you want to say something.
If I could just, I think that's true. I think you've seen a healthy debate in Germany about the environmental impacts and how this might, and CEPA has done research on this, how this might impact Germany's effort for renewable and green energy, and if the project goes forward, it could have a negative impact. So there's a robust debate going on in Germany about the impacts. And so I think that's absolutely right. If I could also point out, sorry, is even if we do pursue sanctions, if companies do not back out, we're not sanctioning a country. We're not sanctioning broad swaths of people, the German people or the Russian people. These are on specific companies that aid and abet a Russian malign influence campaign.
Thank you, Chris. I want to another question we have here from Steve Erlanger, whom we all know as the New York Times' excellent chief European diplomatic correspondent. And Steve asks if we could explicitly comment on some explicit European criticisms that are out there. I think this any one of you can handle this. These criticisms are: it's too late. This is just another wild use of U.S. sanctions, and the U.S. simply wants to sell more and more expensive LNG to Europe. Just to get there, Steve is just throwing those European criticisms out there that he's heard, and I was wondering if we could. Yeah, I'm sure each of you in turn can knock those. Ben, I see you're rearing to go, so go for it.
Well, no, it's a great question, and thanks for that question from the New York Times. Some say this is not the right time in the transatlantic relationship for this sort of action, and certainly there's a lot of tension, no question there. In terms of foreign policy, The plans and proclamations of this White House in the past several months to actively dismantle core elements of transatlantic security infrastructure, whether it's a decision to remove 9,500 troops from Germany, to talks of resuming nuclear testing, to withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty, et cetera, they're worrying, and they'll harm US and European national security interests to the benefit of Kremlin's strategic aims. And while these are all dismal missteps, and they'll undoubtedly have long-term reputational damage for the role of the United States, fortunately, they've all been met with bipartisan opposition on Capitol Hill, and they're all policies that, like it or not, they can be reversed to enable a rebuilding of security norms and trust over time. The difference here, and the reason that this is so important right now, is that the same can't be said about the Kremlin's energy plans in Europe, which hinge on the development of permanent physical infrastructure, things that would be generational, that would have a decades-long impact on transatlantic national security interests should they be completed, and thus they're not easily reversed through short-term security policy planning. And so it's due to this technical reality, it's really heartening to see that both US and Europe have continued to be resolute when you look at supporting Europe's energy diversification, which unfortunately will alone not mitigate the core national security concerns of the project. We need to keep working with Europe on this, but that alone will not mitigate those concerns. And hence we need to do this in order to make sure that this physical infrastructure, this technology-based infrastructure doesn't destabilize Europe's energy security, Ukraine's strategic stability, and transatlantic national security interests for decades to come.
Brian, let me just come in behind Ben and just reinforce that, look, two administrations have opposed. Ben already mentioned how there's broad bipartisan support, but two administrations have opposed Nord Stream 2. And we opposed Nord Stream 2 before LNG exports were both legally possible and financially and technologically possible. And so this isn't really about LNG exports. US and Middle Eastern and other LNG exports contribute to diversity of energy supplies and routes and sources. But this is not about US LNG. This is about countering Russian malign influence and Russian aggression in Europe.
Thank you, Chris. Margarita, I know you're dying to jump in, so have at it, man.
Just one comment on the expensive LNG gas, that this is why America is sanctioning Nord Stream 2 to sell to Europe expensive LNG gas. The facts showed us these two consecutive winters that the LNG gas drove gas prices in Europe much lower, much lower than Russian prices. As a result, Russia had to reduce its prices too. The factor is that LNG became available to Europe because of two warm winters in Asia. So the demand was the same, but the supply was a lot more there, and that drove the price down. So the argument that LNG is driving the price up is absolutely false. It does not correspond with the facts. The other thing I want to say is Nord Stream 2 is going to contribute to the delivery of 70% of Russian gas to Germany via one route, one pipeline, and that's not directly to Western markets, which are more lucrative markets. And when they're asking me why is this pipeline evil and the transit through Ukraine is not, it doesn't matter whether it's through Ukraine or it's through Poland or it's through Belarus. The question is, there need to be diversification of routes and there need to be diversification of supplies. When we welcome Caspian gas, because that's going to be diversification of supplies, of supply source, we do not welcome another pipeline coming from Russia to Western Europe or another pipeline coming from Russia directly to Turkey, because this is actually encircling completely Central and Eastern Europe and making the delivery of gas to that part of Europe much more difficult.
Thank you, Margarita. And it's as I look at these, I mean, this question, I'm really glad this question was asked, and I'm really glad this is all getting on the record, because like those that make this argument, the U.S. is just trying to steal the European gas market, don't really understand how energy markets work clearly. John, if you do have any comments on this particular issue?
I think it's been well covered. Thank you.
Okay, no, and As I look at the questions coming in, it seems we have a pretty much an all-star audience out here. This question comes from Ambassador Daniel Fried. And he says, I like Ben's suggestion for transatlantic norms and investment transparency and common norms for conflict of interest post-employment restrictions for former senior officials. I also like Chris Robinson's emphasis on energy projects to reduce CE energy vulnerability, Central and Eastern Europe energy vulnerability. How much can these and similar initiatives mitigate the downside risks of Nord Stream 2 if it is in fact completed? So I guess if Chris and Ben, you want to address that and address Ambassador Fried's question there in turn.
Ben, if you want, go ahead first.
Oh, okay, sure. Well, no, I appreciate that comment from Ambassador Fried. I think it's vital that we focus on what sort of regulatory legislative norms in the U.S. to keep our own house in order, because certainly we are not immune to this. There is elite capture going on as we speak here in the U.S. from Russian enterprises, state-owned enterprises and elsewhere, whether it's directly on behalf of the Russian companies or cutouts, Western companies that are then directly aiding and abetting, as Secretary Pompeo said, Russian malign energy or technology or other interests. So we have to come to that consensus, because again, as I said, that's what we're looking at when we have this debate over Huawei around the world, when we look at Chinese state-owned enterprises. This is going to continue to come up and come up and come up, because there's always a company out there that's going to want to get short-term economic gain, and there's always former officials that will like to do the same thing. And the thing is, and what I tried to point out in my opener, is that the media coverage and public discourse in the United States doesn't always get the details right, but it at least folks know that that's the wrong thing. You don't work in government and then step out and work for one of our adversaries. The problem is, in Europe, there's certain countries where the public doesn't respond. So if the public isn't even responding, what good is it to hector a former official on the merits of doing this or not? They can get a sweet payday. There doesn't have to be some sort of clandestine discussion saying, if you support this while you're in office, this project, then you'll get this deal. They see that this just goes on. There's not, much of a public outcry, and there's certainly no regulatory norms that counter this in many European countries. So why not? And so we really have to do two things: is host and understand what the national security impacts of these sort of moves are by current and former officials on the one hand, so that the public understands and demands that their governments take regulatory action. And the United States can do a lot by diplomacy. And I just want to add that word diplomacy. This issue of Nord Stream 2 has been going on since 2015. Okay, this is not something new. Former Vice President Joe Biden was, I think, the first very senior official to decry the pipeline. He called it a bad deal for Europe when he was in Stockholm back in 2016. This is one of the rare areas of foreign policy consensus between the Obama and the Trump administrations, certainly on Capitol Hill, from Senator McCain back several years ago to a wide array of senators and representatives today. But sanctions was not the first option. This was not the first thing the U.S. was engaging with. We engaged with every single country in the transatlantic space, from Canada to the EU to countries on the periphery of the EU, because the diplomatic approach is extremely important in having this discussion. Unfortunately, Germany, for all of the revelations in the past several months, is still not calling for at least a political drop of support for the project. I mean, they're calling for sanctions and other countermeasures for the extrajudicial assassination in Berlin and the Bundestag hack by the Russians. It would be a minimum step to withdraw political support. And that's a diplomatic measure, and I'm hoping that Berlin can still come through there.
Ben really hit the nail on the head in terms of how much diplomatic work has gone into it to this point, and that sanctions really weren't the first tool we reached for in order to address this threat. I think Ambassador Fried is correct in that these other actions can help mitigate some of the impact over time. But we have an immediate security challenge that if this pipeline goes forward, all the other challenges, the elite capture, the European security issues, the impact on Europe's energy security that Ben and Ambassador Herbst and Margarita have already laid out, all those come into effect immediately. And so we are compelled to strengthen our toolbox, if you will, and make the risk for those who engage in this project all that more clear because of the immediate threat and challenge posed.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, what I appreciated about Ambassador Fried's question is that it addresses the underlying cause of this. So there are not these issues in the future. Continuing with our celebrity questioners, with their next question comes from Thomas Klein-Brockhoff, a vice president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States and well-known German journalist. And Thomas asks, how do the panelists view the future of the transatlantic relationship when one major partner imposes sanctions on another major ally? We've addressed this to a degree, but here's another way to look at it. How do the panelists expect the Germans to respond to something that they see as an illegal infringement on their sovereignty? I think any of our panelists can address this, but I think, Chris, you're smiling, and I think this one's for you.
Look, again, we're not imposing sanctions on an ally. Let's be clear. We're not sanctioning a government. We're not sanctioning a people. If sanctions go forward, were mandatory sanctions under the PISA Act, they would be for specific companies engaged in support to this malign project, very clearly. I think, going forward, we need to do more to address as the transatlantic community, whether it's at the EU, we do a lot at the EU, whether it's at NATO, or whether it's on bilateral basis, to do more to counter Russian malign influence and Russian aggression. That has to continue. And I think that will continue even if we disagree on elements of this particular project.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Margarita, please.
I want to counterpoint this. Why is always American intervention and threat of sanctions has to solve very, very serious European energy security matters? The same happened with South Stream. When the European Union was supposed to intervene and supposed to introduce procedures against Bulgaria, they did it eventually, not for South Stream, but for forming a company against the regulations of the European Union between Bulgargas and Gazprom. But American threat of sanctions of the companies that were accepted to work on South Stream pipeline in Bulgaria, that included Timchenko's companies. This is what stopped the project eventually. When the Bulgarians were told, every company that cooperates and works with Timchenko is going to be subject to sanctions. I wish to see more resolute approach by the European Union when economic project that is perceived as economic project by Germany, but political project by Russia is causing so much damage and technically endangers the security of Ukraine. Without those pipelines, how are Germany and France going to protect Ukraine's security? We are going to enter a much more serious problem. And I think we're underestimating it, because looking at Russia, the more weakness we see in Russia, the more decline we see caused by the pandemic or the oil crisis or the protests in Khabarovsk and other cities, the more aggression we can expect around Russia's borders. Are we prepared for that? Why are we ready to compromise with one pipeline, making excuses that it's only economic project, when things are much more serious and Germany has to see it? The other thing, I think German companies got involved in this project. There are more than 200 companies that have contracts to build Nord Stream 2 and to build the connecting pipeline UGAL. And this is the problem of the German chancellor. It's very difficult for her to alienate the business community with stopping the decision to stop the project. And I I think that the resolution would have been in European Commission to stop it, and take it off the hands of Chancellor Merkel, but this didn't happen. Eventually, somebody has to step in because the security crisis in Europe is going to be a security crisis for the United States as well.
John, I think you want to say.
I could jump in for a second too. I think the question was stated in a very polemical way. I think that what the questioner accuses the United States of doing vis-a-vis Germany, the Germans could be accused of vis-a-vis the European Union and pushing very hard for Nord Stream 2 to get approved within the EU. And also, I think the German hand was evident in exempting Nord Stream 2 from the third energy package. The other point, of course, was already made in this conversation, which was there's by no means one opinion in Germany about this. The German defense minister was outspoken in her opposition to this a year or so ago, and then for political reasons decided to quiet down. So this is a much more complicated matter than as stated in that question.
Ben?
Yeah, I just want to add in, I've been engaging on this issue for years and spent a lot of time in my State Department role in Berlin and at the various agencies around Germany engaging on this deeply. And folks from the outside have often accused me, you must be anti-German or something like that. Couldn't be further from the truth. I have a degree in German. I worked at the Max Planck Institute for Kernphysik and the Max Planck Gesellschaft in my physics career. And this I think is an example of the broader concern that we have for Germany. This isn't anti-German. This is concern for European security. And that's why I was so concerned when Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer said last week, there's a concern that, quote, there's a concern that Germany would become too dependent on Russian gas, a concern that we were able to diffuse. This hasn't been diffused at all. As Margarita said, there are over 20 countries that have expressed concerns or outright opposition to the project. The European Parliament is recently as March continues to call for the project to be abandoned, not just that they have concerns about the pipeline, but that it should actually be abandoned. And this is reflected, as I said, by a broad majority of transatlantic nations. So it's really imperative that we look at what is the concern here. The concern is Russia's malign activities and its strategic corruption. It's not about Germany, and it's not about a transatlantic rift between the US and Germany, which is just kind of a bonus for Putin, because he's either going to get the physical infrastructure that does the national security damage to Ukraine and Europe, or he's going to get a rift between the US and Germany, and very possibly both. But I think that with these sanctions, unlike what some have said, that it's inevitable, this is going to happen anyway, so why act? Look, the facts don't support that. The NDAA sanctions in December actually stopped the pipeline's physical construction, and the combination of the CATSA sanctions plus this clarification act that's currently moving with much speed through both the House and the Senate will have that technology calibrated approach, not a sectoral sanctions approach, which I would oppose, right? Something that would have broad diplomatic consequences, but just a pinprick sanctions that stops a very specific malign vector, which is Nord Stream 2.
Thank you. We are pushing up against the end, but I actually see a question from somebody we all know and respect, and I would not be able to sleep with soundly if I did not take a question from Hanna Hopko, our very good friend, the former deputy speaker of the Ukrainian parliament. So I'm going to ask you all to be really brief because the people in the back room are going to kill me if I let this run over too long. But Hanna asks, she says, the financing of Russian geopolitical revanchism and military aggression, including subversive activities through the agents within Ukraine and the EU, is carried out mainly through the export of energy resources, which provides the income to the Putin regime. In this regard, it can be concluded that if the EU had the political will, it could block Russian expansionism and aggression by restricting energy imports from Russia. But it is not. Hanna calls the sanctions against Nord Stream 2 as important to Ukraine's security as the sale of the Javelins. And she asks, does the US have a broader strategy to stop Russian geopolitical expansionism, and I'm presuming through cutting off the financing of it? I would ask you each to hit on that briefly, because I would not be able to live with myself if I did not take Hanna's question.
All right, well, let me start. I think broadly, yes. I mean, this administration is very focused, and we have been, frankly, over two administrations focused on countering Russian aggression and its geopolitical ambitions. And that's true whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Mediterranean and Prigozhin activities in Libya, or whether it's Russian support for Maduro in Venezuela. We are working to counter Russian aggression using a range of tools. Sanctions, as Ben has pointed out, are one tool. Diplomacy, as Dan Fried suggested, transparency mechanisms are all part of those efforts to counter Russian aggression where we find it. That's correct. I think one of the front lines is what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. And I think as many of the commentators have said and the questions have pointed to, Europe needs to do more to counter that same Russian aggression, including with regard to energy security.
John?
I would add that I would agree largely with Chris that American policy is designed to counter Russian malign activities globally. The administration has pursued this policy and Congress even more strongly. We could be a little bit better. We could be a little bit more, a little bit faster. For example, we never put serious sanctions on the Kremlin for the Straits of Kerch incident. But by and large, the tendency has been strong and good.
Ben, Margarita, any last words before we wrap it up?
I wanted to remind everybody who is listening today, when they say that the sanctions are against Germany and Germany needs that pipeline, we need to remember that the plans for Ugal pipeline are to transit the 55 BCM of gas from Nord Stream 2, but to leave only 9 BCM in Germany. How can we claim that Germany needs the pipeline when only 9 BCM is going to stay in Germany? The rest is going to be transited through the Czech Republic all the way to Central and Eastern Europe. And again, our strategy for countering Russian, I call it malicious influence or subversive influence, should be much wider. And we should be looking into what is happening in Russia when we design this strategy so that we're not surprised with a number of security crises that Russia has managed to prepare and start in the neighboring countries.
Ben, last word to you briefly.
Yeah, my last word is just to build on the themes that we've heard here and what Margarita just said. There are technical realities when it comes to energy security, and there's a host of national security issues that have a strong science and technology component, whether it's COVID or climate change or Nord Stream 2. And that's where you really get in integrating that sort of analysis in addition to the quote unquote standard, but extremely important economic and geopolitical analysis. That's where you can get something like we have in the Nord Stream 2 context, technology calibrated sanctions that are not just, well, we'll just sanction Gazprom and hope for the best. This is well thought out. This is not something that was done in haste. And again, it's just the underscoring that, more broadly in the national security infrastructure, we need more science and technology, not only in areas that are traditional science and technology areas, but in core national security and transatlantic security issues.
Great, thank you, Ben. And on that note, we shall wrap it up. And I want to thank our 4 excellent panelists. Chris Robinson is the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Russia. Margarita Asanova is a fellow with CEPA's Democratic Resilience Program. Ambassador John Herbst is the director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. And Dr. Benjamin L. Schmidt is a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard University and former European Energy Security Advisor at the U.S. State Department. And a big thanks to our virtual audience out there in YouTube land. Thank you for all the excellent and insightful questions, and we shall see you next time.